August 1934. The prison boat cut through the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, carrying its most famous passenger toward the island that would become his grave. Al Capone stood on the deck in shackles, watching Alcatraz grow larger on the horizon, a fortress of concrete and steel perched on a rock, designed specifically for men like him. Men who couldn't be held anywhere else. Men who were too dangerous, too connected, too powerful for ordinary prisons. The morning fog clung to the water, making the island appear and disappear like something from a nightmare. Other prisoners on the boat, bank robbers, kidnappers, men who'd killed federal agents, stood silent, watching the rock emerge from the mist. Everyone knew what Alcatraz meant. Everyone had heard the stories about the place where troublemakers went to be broken. Capone was 35 years old, and the world knew his name, public enemy number one. The man who'd controlled Chicago, who'd made millions, who'd walked with presidents and movie stars. The newspapers had covered every moment of his trial, his conviction, his sentencing. Now they'd cover this too, America's most notorious gangster locked away on the most infamous prison on earth. He'd spent the last 3 years at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and even there his power had followed him. Money changed hands. Guards looked the other way. He had a radio in his cell, expensive food brought in, visitors whenever he wanted. He'd run his organization from behind bars, maintained control through letters and smuggled messages. Even in prison, Al Capone had been Al Capone, powerful, connected, untouchable. But Alcatraz was different. Alcatraz was built specifically to break men like him, built to prove that no one was above the system, that no amount of money or influence or fear could protect you once you stepped onto the rock. As the boat docked and guards marched him onto the island, Capone squared his shoulders and kept his face impassive. The famous scar on his left cheek was visible even in the dim morning light, a reminder of the violence that had defined his life. He'd survived Brooklyn streets, gang wars, federal investigations, assassination attempts. He'd survived everything life had thrown at him. He'd survived this too. He was Al Capone. Nothing could break him. He was wrong, and on some level, watching the massive walls of Alcatraz loom above him as they led him up the dock, he knew it. They stripped him of his name first. "You're not Al Capone here," the warden said during processing. "You're prisoner number 85. That's what we'll call you. That's who you are now." Capone stood in the cold processing room naked, being searched and cataloged like cargo. Other prisoners had already been through here, men who'd been famous once, who'd had power once. Now they were just numbers: 85, 117, 238, anonymous digits in a system designed to erase identity. "I want to see the warden," Capone said. His voice carried the authority of someone used to getting what he wanted. "You just did," the guard said flatly. "Now put on your uniform." The uniform was rough canvas, striped, deliberately humiliating. Nothing like the silk suits Capone had worn in Chicago, the expensive fabrics that had cost more than most men earned in a year. Here, everyone wore the same thing. Here, wealth and power meant nothing. "I need to make phone call," Capone tried again. "I have people who—" "Prisoner 85, the guard interrupted. "You get one phone call a month, monitored 5 minutes. You want to waste it now?" Capone's jaw tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In Atlanta, he'd had privileges, respect. The guards had known who he was, what he could do, who he could reach. But looking at this guard's face, Capone realized something that made his stomach turn cold. This man didn't care. Didn't fear him, saw him as just another number in a cage. They led him to his cell, a tiny concrete box, 8 feet by 5 feet, with a narrow cot, a sink, a toilet, and nothing else. No radio, no decorations, no comfort. The door clanged shut with a finality that echoed through Capone's bones. For the first time in years, Al Capone was truly alone. The first few months he tried to maintain control, tried to be the man he'd been. During yard time, he'd approach other prisoners, introduce himself, try to establish the pecking order he was used to. "Al Capone," he'd say, extending his hand. "Chicago." Most of them ignored him. A few laughed. "We know who you are," one lifer said, a bank robber named Sullivan who'd been on the rock for 2 years. "We just don't care." Capone felt anger rising, the old violent instinct to put someone in their place. But there were guards everywhere, watching, waiting. Any fight meant solitary confinement. Any step out of line meant losing the few privileges prisoners had. And besides, something else was happening, something he didn't want to acknowledge. He was getting sick. The headaches had started in Atlanta, dull throbs that came and went. He'd ignored them, blamed stress, blamed the prison food. But now they were constant, sharp, like something trying to crack his skull open from the inside. and there were other symptoms: blurred vision, difficulty concentrating, moments where he'd forget what he was doing or where he was. The prison doctor examined him and delivered the diagnosis Capone had been avoiding for years: advanced neurosyphilis. The disease he'd contracted as a teenager, the one he'd tried to treat with mercury and arsenic and every experimental cure money could buy, had finally reached his brain. "How bad is it?" Capone asked. The doctor, a weary man who'd seen every kind of prison ailment, looked at him with something like pity. "Bad, and it's going to get worse. We can try some treatments, but at this stage." He shook his head. "I'm sorry." Capone sat in the infirmary trying to process what that meant. His mind, the thing that had made him successful, that had allowed him to outthink his rivals, to build an empire, to see moves ahead when others saw only the present, was being eaten away by bacteria that had lived in his blood for almost 2 decades. "How long do I have?" he asked. "Before what? Death? Years, probably, but before you." The doctor chose his words carefully. "Before you're not yourself anymore. Could be months, could be less." The decline was gradual at first, so subtle that even Capone didn't fully register what was happening. He'd forget small things: what day it was, what he'd had for breakfast, the name of a guard he'd seen every day for months. He'd start conversations and lose track of what he was saying mid-sentence, the words evaporating from his mind like morning dew. During work assignments in the prison laundry, he'd stand holding a sheet, staring at it with genuine confusion about what he was supposed to do with it, the simple task suddenly incomprehensible. The other prisoners noticed. How could they not? Al Capone, the legend, standing in the middle of the laundry room looking lost and afraid, asking the same question 3 times in 5 minutes. Some pitied him. These were the older cons, the ones who'd been inside long enough to understand that prison broke everyone eventually, just in different ways. They'd watch Capone shuffle past, this shadow of the man who'd once made Chicago tremble, and they'd feel a cold recognition of their own mortality. Others saw opportunity, saw weakness, saw a chance to prove they weren't afraid of the great Al Capone. Was a prisoner named Caruso, a mafia soldier from Philadelphia who'd been arrested in 1935 for racketeering. He'd known of Capone back in the day, had been impressed by the Chicago outfit's power and reach, had even modeled some of his own operations after Capone's example. Seeing Capone now, confused and weakening, forgetting conversations mid-sentence and asking the same questions over and over, Caruso saw only a has-been, a cautionary tale, someone to pity at best and mock at worst. "Hey, 85, Caruso called during yard time, loud enough for others to hear. "I heard you used to be somebody." Capone looked at him, struggling to focus. His eyes had that cloudy quality they'd developed lately, like he was looking at the world through frosted glass. "I'm Al Capone." "Yeah, well, Al Capone's dead. You're just a sick old man pretending to be a ghost." In the old days, the days that felt simultaneously like yesterday and 100 years ago, those words would have meant death. Capone would have had the man killed before sunset, would have made an example of him, would have reminded everyone why you didn't disrespect Al Capone. But here now all Capone could do was turn away, shoulders hunched against the weight of words and laughter that followed him across the yard like ghosts. The guards saw it too. Most of them had no sympathy. Capone was a criminal, a murderer, someone who'd ordered deaths and run illegal operations and corrupted an entire city. He was getting what he deserved, cosmic justice delivered in the form of a degenerating brain. But a few of the older guards, the ones who'd been there from the beginning, who'd processed Capone when he first arrived, full of defiance and certainty, watched his deterioration with something approaching sadness. Guard Robert Miller had been at Alcatraz since it opened in 1934. He'd processed hundreds of prisoners, watched hard men break, seen violence and despair and rage, and every human emotion amplified by the concrete and steel of the rock. But watching Al Capone slowly lose his mind was different. There was something particularly tragic about seeing a man who'd been so powerful, who'd commanded armies of men and controlled an empire, reduced to confusion and fear and the simple terror of not remembering who you are. "He's getting worse," Miller said to another guard during a shift change. "Did you see him at lunch? He couldn't remember how to use his fork, just sat there staring at it." "Good," the other guard said. "He killed people. He deserves whatever he gets." Miller didn't argue. Maybe it was justice, maybe it was karma, but it still felt like watching a slow execution, and something about that didn't sit right. By early 1938, Capone's condition had deteriorated significantly. He had good days and the bad days were getting more frequent. On bad days, he didn't know where he was, didn't recognize the guards, thought he was back in Chicago or Brooklyn or somewhere that existed only in his fragmenting memory. The prison administration moved him to a different cell, closer to the infirmary, where they could keep better watch on him. His cellmate was an old bank robber named Richards who'd agreed to keep an eye on Capone in exchange for extra commissary privileges. He talks to himself, Richards reported to the guards, all night sometimes, has conversations with people who aren't there. Yesterday he was talking to his mother. She's been dead for 5 years. Is he violent? The guard asked. No, just sad, confused. Last night he was crying, asking where me was, where his son was. I told him they weren't here and he got so upset I thought he might hurt himself. That was when they started putting Capone on suicide watch. Not because he'd tried anything, but because the man who'd once controlled an empire was now so lost inside his own deteriorating mind that they couldn't trust him not to harm himself. The moments of clarity were the worst. Capone would come back to himself for a few minutes or hours, would realize where he was and what he'd become, and the horror in his eyes was something the guards learned to look away from. I'm forgetting, he told Dr. Sternberg during one lucid moment. Everything I was, everything I did, it's all just slipping away, like trying to hold water in my hands. I know, the doctor said gently. I'm sorry. Is there anything you can do, anything at all? We're doing everything we can. The treatments might slow it down, but they won't stop it. It wasn't a question. No, they won't stop it. Capone nodded slowly. I built an empire. I had everything. And now I can't even remember how to tie my shoes. He looked at the doctor with eyes that were still sharp despite everything. Tell me honestly, how much longer before I don't know who I am anymore? The doctor hesitated. Months maybe, it's hard to say, every case is different. Months, Capone repeated. Jesus, I'm 39 years old and I'm dying by inches. The moment that broke even the hardest guards came on a Tuesday morning in May 1938. Guard Miller was making his rounds when he heard singing coming from one of the cells. Not the usual prison sounds, cursing, shouting, the general misery of caged men. This was different. It was a child's song, sung in a wavering, uncertain voice. He approached the cell and found Al Capone sitting on his cot, rocking back and forth, singing a nursery rhyme Miller recognized from his own childhood. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Capone's eyes were unfocused, looking at something that wasn't there. His hands moved as if playing with an invisible toy. 85, Miller called softly. Capone, you okay? Capone looked up, and for a moment his eyes cleared. Then they filled with tears. I want to go home, he said, voice small and lost. I want my mama. When can I go home? Miller felt something crack in his chest. This wasn't the hardened criminal, the gangster who'd ordered executions and run illegal operations. This was just a broken man who'd lost everything, including his own mind. Soon, Miller found himself saying, even though it wasn't true, soon, pal. Later, in the guard room, Miller told the story to his colleagues. Some laughed, some shrugged. But a few sat in uncomfortable silence, and Miller knew they felt it too, the strange, awful tragedy of watching someone disappear while their body remained. The warden made a decision a month later. Al Capone, public enemy number 1, prisoner 85, was no longer fit to remain at Alcatraz. He was being transferred to Terminal Island Penitentiary in California to serve out the remainder of his sentence, not because he deserved mercy, but because he was no longer capable of the violence that had sent him there in the first place. On the day of transfer, the other prisoners gathered to watch. Some jeered, some were silent, and a few, the ones who'd watched the descent from the beginning, felt something uncomfortably close to relief that it was ending. Guard Miller escorted Capone to the boat. The man who'd arrived 5 years ago in shackles, defiant and powerful, was now docile and confused, being led like a child. Where are we going? Capone asked. Somewhere better, Miller said. It was a lie, but a kind one. Capone nodded, accepting it without question, and stepped onto the boat. Miller watched the vessel pull away from Alcatraz, carrying what remained of Al Capone toward a future that no longer included fame or power or even basic comprehension. That night, Miller went home to his wife and hugged her tighter than usual. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, he said. Just tell me if I ever start to lose myself. Promise me. She didn't understand, but she promised anyway. Al Capone was released from federal custody in November 1939, his sentence commuted because he was no longer mentally competent. They sent him home to me in Florida, where he would live another 8 years in a fog of confusion and fragments. The newspapers ran the story: Capone released, mind gone. The man who'd terrified Chicago, who'd built an empire, who'd been untouchable, that man was gone. What remained was a shell, a body without the consciousness that had made it formidable. Me cared for him until the end, fed him when he forgot to eat, bathed him when he couldn't remember how, held him when he woke screaming from nightmares he couldn't explain. She never complained, never abandoned him, never stopped loving the man he'd been even as that man ceased to exist. Guard Robert Miller retired from Alcatraz in 1950, 11 years after Capone's release, 3 years after Capone's death. He'd seen hundreds of prisoners come through those gates. He'd seen violence and rage and every kind of human darkness. But 30 years later, when his grandchildren asked him about his time on the Rock, about the famous prisoners he'd guarded, there was one story he could never quite bring himself to tell. The story of finding Al Capone singing nursery rhymes to invisible friends. The story of watching the most powerful gangster in American history reduced to a confused child asking for his mother. Because some falls from grace are so complete, so total that even the people who witness them feel something break inside. And Al Capone's fall broke everyone who saw it, not because they loved him, not because he deserved sympathy, but because in his deterioration they saw the truth that every person fears, that power is temporary, that strength is an illusion, and that in the end we're all just fragile minds and fragile bodies, one disease away from losing everything that makes us who we are. The empire fell, the legend faded. But the memory of that fallen king, sitting in a cell singing children's songs, haunted Alcatraz long after Al Capone left it. And the guards who'd witnessed it learned a lesson that prison walls can't teach. There are some things worse than death, some fates more terrible than any sentence a judge can hand down. And Al Capone, public enemy number one, experienced them all.